So, picture Mars, not as the dry, rusted ball we see through telescopes today, but as a colder cousin of early Earth. Thin clouds drifting across a deep salmon sky, scattered lakes steaming in the chill air, and on the horizon, a line of impossible mountains. The Tharsis volcanoes. Before there were canyon megacities or ocean empires, this was the whole world to the first Martian civilizations. Tucked into the warm folds around those supervolcanoes, shielded from the worst of the cold, the Proto-Tharsis Kingdoms learned how to turn steam, stone, and a stubborn planet into a new thing: culture. When later Martians told stories about their own age of beginnings, this is who they were really talking about. Half myth, half memory. Very real people trying to survive on a world that was already starting to slip away from them. Imagine your entire world squeezed into a chain of valleys wrapped around mountains the size of countries. That was the Proto-Tharsis belt. The rest of Mars, even in those days, was harsher, colder plains, dustier highlands, places where the air bit your lungs if you lingered too long. But around Tharsis, geothermal vents opened into the crust like a scattered constellation of life support points. Steam rose from fissures, warming pockets of air. Mineral-rich hot springs cut terraces into black basalt. On those terraces, the first Martian villages clung like lichens to a warm rock. Life there organized itself around heat. At the center of each settlement sat a steam court, a natural or widened vent where warm vapor billowed up through carved stone channels. Families dried food over those channels. Artisans softened and fused volcanic glass. Above all, the priests and monarchs, usually the same people, used them as ritual stages, reading the shifting plumes like oracles. Around the courts, circular compounds of stacked stone climbed the valley walls, each level a bit cooler than the one below. Social status literally measured in degrees of warmth. They carved their first writing into obsidian plates, set directly over low, steady vents. The heat kept the stone from fracturing in the cold, and gave the glyphs a faint gloss. Their script spiraled out from a central point, echoing the swirl of steam they saw every day. Those spirals will become the backbone of Martian writing for tens of thousands of years, flattened and stylized in Hellas. Formalized for trade in Valles Marineris, sanctified on the steps of Olympus Mons. But here they're still raw, experimental scratches. Next to the glyphs, in little niches, they placed red plasma stones. Strange, translucent nodules, unearthed near the hottest fissures, pulsing faintly when heated. The Proto-Tharsis people didn't yet know how to harness them as technology, but they knew they were special. To them, these stones were crystallized breath of the deep planet, holy embers left by the first fires of Mars. With steady heat and trickling water from vent-fed channels, they grew the first surplus. Mushrooms and pale root crops flourished in shaded terraces. Thin-leafed shrubs clung to the warm rock, their sap turned into resins and primitive medicines. For the first time on Mars, someone had the luxury to step back from pure survival and ask useless questions. What is the sky doing? Why do the stars shift? Why does the steam court cough differently before a quake? Those useless questions, of course, turn into calendars, myths, and the first political arguments over who really speaks for the volcanoes. In these narrow, steaming valleys, civilization doesn't arrive with a bang. It condenses, like fog on warm stone. Now, when you cram an entire species' hopes into a thin line of habitable ground, conflict is basically baked into the landscape. Long before gleaming ships crossed the ancient Northern Ocean, before merchant caravans threaded Valles Marineris, the first Martian wars were over the least glamorous treasure you can imagine: thermal real estate. A good vent wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was the difference between a crowded village and a scattering of starving outcasts. As populations grew along the Tharsis belt, these vent wars erupted. One of the oldest remembered stories, retold and distorted in later ages, speaks of a feud between a high-vent kingdom perched on a Tharsis flank and the low-mist clan in a sheltered ravine below. The high-vent people claimed the upper fissures, where the heat was stable and strong. The low-mist clan depended on the condensed moisture that drifted down valley. When slight shifts in the crust diverted steam upward, the mist thinned. The low-mist people blamed their neighbors, accusing them of stealing not just heat but the breath of their children. The weapons were simple obsidian-tipped spears, slings loaded with glassy shards. But the social technology born from those clashes was sophisticated. The Proto-Tharsis invented truces around shared vents, rotating occupation rights by lunar cycles. They traded hostages, formalizing the idea that a prince or priest could be collateral for peace. They began tallying tribute measured in baskets of dried fungi, or bundles of plasma stone fragments on those spiral glyphs. Out of desperation for warm ground, they pioneered diplomacy, bureaucracy, and the quiet art of not killing each other when it would be more profitable to cooperate. If you fast forward 10, 20, 40,000 years across Martian history, you keep running into ghosts from these first steam-wreathed valleys. Peel back the grand ceremonies of the Olympus Mons theocracy, its towering step temples, its thunderous mountain hymns, and underneath you see thin, older shapes, vent priests huddled around a steaming fissure, listening for subtle rumbles in the rock. What started as practical tremor reading, a way to tell if your village might be in danger of a gas burst or quake, slowly inflated into divine prophecy. By the time the theocracy takes power around 30,000 years ago, the mountain itself is a god, and its voice is interpreted by a class of priests whose distant ancestors were simply cautious engineers with good ears. Head across the planet to Hellas Basin, and you see the same inheritance. When the Hellas Empire rises in its deep, air-rich bowl, it needs a unifying script for law and irrigation records. They reach back through traders, through old Highland lore, and adopt a smoothed, formal version of the Proto-Tharsis spirals. Scribes carve them into thick basin tablets, no longer warm obsidian but pale stone. Each loop now a little stiffer, more rectangular, easier to stack in archives. In those archives, you can find archaic royal names and placewords no Hellas citizen can properly translate anymore. They're echoes of Proto-Tharsis kings and valleys, preserved like fossils in bureaucracy. The southern highland tribes, roaming warriors and astronomer priests, carry another piece of the legacy. Their famed starpath navigation journeys traced by memory of constellations and the gradual dimming of the sky likely began with Tharsis skywatchers. Those early observers, with time on their hands and steam at their backs, noticed that something was off. The nights were getting colder, the air a touch thinner generation by generation. They wrapped those observations in poetry, talking about the sky loosening its grip, or the world's breath escaping to the mountains. Centuries later, Marineris philosophers will argue over those same lines, copied and recopied onto canyon walls. Even red plasma stone carries a cultural through-line. In Proto-Tharsis shrines, the stones sit as sacred embers, offerings to the deep planet. By the era of the Oceanus Borealis empires, someone finally leans harder into the physics, building crude devices that use the stone's strange behavior near heat and magnetic fields to pump water or power dim lights on ocean barges. But when their engineers look at a plasma stone sparking inside a copper frame, they still recognize the shape. It's the same glowing heart that once sat beside spiraled prayers in a vent-lit temple. Technology advances, symbolism lingers. Taken together, the Proto-Tharsis Kingdoms are like an old operating system no one fully deletes. Every later civilization installs its own shiny interface, but deep down, those first scripts, rituals, and survival strategies keep running, shaping what Martians believe is even possible. Now, you might be wondering, this is all very cinematic, but how do we on Earth, even in fiction, know anything about people who lived 50 millennia before the last Martian cities died out? The answer is archaeology, but turned up to planetary scale. The Tharsis Plateau is a layer cake of civilizations, all stacked along the same warm spine. Each new culture found the same good ground and built right on top of whoever came before. By the time of the final civilizations, when Martians huddle in underground cities and raise atmospheric towers to claw a few more centuries from a fading sky, Proto-Tharsis ruins are already ancient beyond comprehension. Their terraces on the old slopes of Tharsis are half-collapsed, filled with wind-blown dust. Final-era builders carve chambers into those older stones, repurposing obsidian plates as door lintels and altar faces. They treat the spiral glyphs like mystical sigils, overlaying their own neat, compressed script on top. One plate might bear 3 different hands. Faint Proto-Tharsis spirals. bold Hellas-style glyphs from a later restoration, and tight final-era markings commenting on both, the way a medieval monk might annotate a Roman scroll. To human explorers arriving long after everything has gone silent, the effect is like reading a palimpsest of an entire planet's memory. In crater walls along Tharsis, erosion exposes cross-sections, foundations of steam court villages, then heavier stone from intermediate kingdoms, then the reinforced chambers of the last underground sanctuaries. In some lucky spots, obsidian archive rooms have collapsed in such a way that they sealed themselves. Inside, plates still sit in their racks, some cracked by slow cooling, some strangely still faintly warm from residual geothermal channels far below. When we, in this imagined future, decode the deepest, oldest symbols under the later scribbles, we finally get a glimpse of how the first Martians described their world, and more hauntingly, how early they sensed that something was wrong with the sky. For all their ingenious adaptations, the Proto-Tharsis Kingdoms didn't go out in a single dramatic apocalypse. No world-ending eruption, no instant freeze. Their story ends in the way that feels uncomfortably familiar to us. A long, uneven decline that's hard to see when you're living through it. Over thousands of years, the atmosphere keeps thinning. Nights stretch colder. Frosts creep lower down the valleys, and vents that once breathed steady warmth start to sputter or shift. At first, it's manageable. Harvests shrink a little. Families crowd closer to the most reliable steam courts. Priests adjust their rituals, declaring that the volcano spirits demand stricter taboos, richer offerings. But you can't bribe physics. Some kingdoms fall into chronic resource wars, vent raids becoming more desperate as marginal ground turns uninhabitable. Others gamble on movement. Scout bands push farther downslope, into regions where the air still feels a bit thicker, the cold a bit less murderous. Over generations, those migrants stop being Proto-Tharsis people who moved and become something new. Some merge with hardy highland clans, their Steam Valley myths blending into the oral traditions of the southern highland tribes, who will one day roam half a planet under the stars. Others trail ancient riverbeds toward future basins. Ancestors distant, unknowing of those who will later build in Hellas's deep shelter. Back in the original heartland, villages shrink, temples close as vents cool. A few last kings cling to half-warm courts, presiding over ceremonies that are mostly about remembering when the world was larger. Their myths fill with language of departure. We go following the lowlands. We chase the thicker breath. They don't experience a single collapse day. They experience a drawn-out realization that their cradle is becoming a tomb, and the only honest response is to leave if you can, or to etch your story as deep into stone as possible if you can't. When later Martian cultures look back, they see the Proto-Tharsis Kingdoms as distant ancestors and cautionary tales. When we look back, from another planet altogether, we see something else as well. The prototype of the Martian tragedy, a planet generous enough to spark civilizations, but restless and fragile enough to slowly corner them. Every empire that follows Olympus, Marineris, Oceanus, Borealis, Hellas, the final underground cities, will replay some version of that same arc. For all their alienness, those first Steam Valley monarchs feel oddly close to home. Clever, proud, improvising as the climate shifts under their feet, trying to turn geology and weather into meaning before both slip away.